Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified. An answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of civil services examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 6th of November 2021. The articles which we are going to cover today have been displayed on the screen. Let us now begin the discussion.
Charting a trade route after MC12. So the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference is being convened in Geneva, Switzerland at the end of this month. And this is 1.5 years after it was scheduled to be held in Kazakhstan in 2020. But of course, it was postponed due to COVID pandemic, just like all other things in our lives. Now the MC12 is being held at an important juncture when the global trade scenario is quite upbeat. And so in this regard, the author discusses some of the issues and challenges which are plaguing WTO currently. Now, why is it important for civil services examination? Now, if you have seen the syllabus of GS paper 2, you must have seen an important line. Important international institutions, agencies and fora, their structure, mandate. And so in this regard, not just for the prelims examination, obviously this is important for that, but from the perspective of mains examination, there are few things which are very important. And so in this regard, we will start by first understanding why is there a need for such an international organization. Why in the backdrop of World War II, a need was felt for that, GATT was created, and then finally WTO took it from there. So we'll understand the basics of WTO, its advantages, and then finally we will look into the challenges currently being faced by WTO. Now starting with the basics, because most of our viewers are quite new and for them it is very important to understand how and why it was created. So before WTO there existed a GATT or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It more or less functioned on the same lines, which was created in 1948 to regulate world trade. And it was created as a means to boost economic recovery after Second World War by reducing and eliminating trade tariffs, quotas and subsidies. So during the Great Depression, a breakdown of international relations and an increase in trade regulation made poor economic condition even worse, and it contributed to the outbreak of Second World War. And just as the war finished, allies believed that a multilateral framework for the world trade would loosen the protectionist policies that defined 1930s. Now, what are the protectionist policies and what are these tariffs and quotas and subsidies? So these are a way to carry out protectionism, which is a practice of following protectionist state policy, which allows for the government of a country to promote its own domestic producers, service providers, and thereby boost their domestic production of goods and services. For example, let's say if there is a government contract, and if Government of India mandates that only Indian companies can bid for that contract, that is a kind of protectionism. Similarly, let's say that Government of India puts a limit on how much cars can be imported, let's say 100 per year, that is a quota. Similarly, Government of India can impose, let's say 100% import duty on a lot of products, and that is tariff. Or in other ways, the Government of India can provide domestic producer of cars 50% rebate in, let's say, iron and steel. And so that is a subsidy. And so all these kinds of measures are called protectionist policies. So the taxes or duties imposed on imports are known as tariffs. Restriction on the volume of import are known as quotas. And negative taxes or tax credits are known as subsidies. So these are the three main ways of providing protection. And let us understand them by an image which you can see on your screen. So these are tariffs. Then government provides subsidies, which allows producers to lower the price of local goods and services because they are getting benefits from the government. Then you impose quotas. And then no matter how low a fee sets the price through subsidies, it cannot ship more goods because there is a limit on how much you can import. And even if that good is very cheap, you cannot import more than that. And then finally, you tweak with the currency. Deliberate attempt by a country to lower its currency value, which would make its exports cheaper and more competitive. So in the build-up of World War II, most developed countries across the world increasingly resorted to these four methods, and because of which the global trade was suffering, because protectionism has its own fair share of disadvantages. Of course, it offers more growth opportunity, lower imports, more jobs, and higher GDP for the local population or for the residents of the country. But in the longer term, it is not good for any economy. Why? Because, first and foremost, it leads to stagnation of technological advancement. As domestic producers don't need to worry about foreign competition, they have no incentive to innovate or spend resources on R&D of new products. Similarly, there is very limited choice for consumers. If you ask your parents about the choices they had about electronics good or even cars, they would tell you that they were not available because consumers have access to fewer goods in a market as a result of limitations on how much foreign goods can be imported because of protectionist policies. There is increase in prices due to lack of competition. Consumers will need to pay more without seeing any significant improvement in the product. And since there are very less number of choices, consumer has to choose what is available. And finally, it leads to economic isolation. Because there are high tariffs, there are quotas, and there are subsidies given to local markets and local producers, that country or that economy becomes to grow increasingly distant from other economies, and so the exchange of ideas is minimum, and which leads to not just economic but also political and cultural isolation. Just try to think of North Korea when you talk about protectionism. It's just not economically isolated but also culturally and politically. And so that is why a need was felt to create an organization which would counter protectionism, would liberalize trade by reducing tariffs and removing quotas among member countries. This will not just counter protectionism but increase in global trade, which would then boost the war-ravaged economy of World War II scenario. And so in this context, GATT was thought of. Ultimately, it was taken over by WTO later on, but this is the context in which WTO works. So far, we have understood why it is important to have a global institution working towards a global trade or a rule-based trading system. So some important aspects of WTO is that it was established in 1995, or rather it took over or changed its form from GATT to WTO, and it is a successor of that, and it deals just not with goods, which was the main emphasis of GATT, but it deals with services, intellectual property, dispute settlement, as well as trade monitoring. An important aspect is that it is not a specialized agency of United Nations. Although it has an arrangement with the United Nations through which it maintains strong relation with United Nations. So this is a very important information. And so WTO functions for smooth, free and predictable global trade, or for the creation of free trade, which is a policy that means governments do not charge people to import or bring in goods from other countries or make exporter pay taxes to send their goods abroad. Because you need to understand that when companies invest in other countries, they want the trading rules to not change suddenly in their disadvantage. And for that, they need protection. And so that framework is provided by WTO. And so it is important for us to understand and appreciate the advantages which are derived from WTO. So first and foremost is that it talks about a gradual reduction of tariffs. As you can clearly see the example of United States on your screen. On your y-axis we have tariffs as a percentage of imports, and on x-axis you have years. And if you start looking from 1940, you can clearly see a gradual reduction in the import duties imposed by United States. And similar is the case with other countries as well. And so it talks about gradual reduction of tariffs and through which it wants to promote free trade. Then it acts as a legal framework, not just for negotiation of countries or among them, but also for other kinds of trade barriers as well. Then it enables trade without any discrimination, and it is not like that WTO is just a body vouching for free trade or completely free trade, which means no tariffs, no barriers, no quotas, nothing. It allows for tariffs and trade restrictions under certain conditions. For example, if a country A feels that a country B is exporting very cheap raw material which is artificially deflated then the country A can impose duties without violating WTO rules. Similarly, there are clauses such as national security which a country can utilize to impose significant barriers to trade for a specific country. And then finally, all these rules are to protect fair competition because there are rules which member countries have to abide by. Whether it is about subsidies or contracts or import or export, once you become a member of WTO, your national rules have to align by the general framework. And so that is how the disadvantages of protectionism are countered. It leads to lower prices for consumers because then imports become cheaper. It promotes fair trade because then foreign companies can function in any of the countries which are member and can expect a fair treatment from the government. Then it leads to specialization because when all companies are treated equally, then the companies can produce a product anywhere across the world. And that location is mainly decided by the factor of manufacturing cost and not other policies like quotas and tariffs and other barriers. And finally, it leads to the development of economies of scale. Because by encouraging free trade, firms can specialize and produce higher quantity. This enables even more economies of scale, which is important for industries, especially in the current context. And the success of WTO is demonstrated by the raw data. WTO has over 160 members representing 98% of world trade. There has been an increase in the trade dispute which have been brought to WTO, showing that WTO indeed has become a forum to help resolve these disputes. Also, WTO regulations have helped avoid a major trade war. And finally, let's see the data. So on your screen, this graph shows world exports as a percentage of GDP. So on the y-axis, you have exports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP, and on x-axis, you have timeline, and you can clearly see an increasing trend throughout. So this clearly shows increasing global trade in last 50 years since the time a global rule-based order was established in global trade. Despite all its advantages, there are some issues, and they are significant ones. There are a lot of areas where WTO has been severely criticized. On one hand, it is true that it has led to counter protectionism, but on the other hand, it is also true that it has given rise to inequalities, not just in terms of wealth, but also in terms of industrial and other kinds of development. Let us understand how. So first and foremost criticism of WTO is that it is unfavorable to developing nations because it is derived from GATT, which was established in the context of World War II, and all the victors and the global north came together to frame a rule which was very beneficial to them. For example, let's take the case of tariff protection. This is the way which was resorted to by developed countries during the time of Industrial Revolution. They utilized heavy import duties to stop the import of goods from foreign countries. US did it to exclude Germany, Germany did it to exclude Britain, and each one of them did for each other. They utilized these tariff and quotas to grow their economy. And now once they are developed, they have access to technology, they have access to capital, and now they want developing countries to significantly reduce their tariff barriers. They want India to significantly reduce and continuously lower their import duties. And so we know that countries like India and other countries do not have industrial base. And at that point of time, if the import duty is significantly reduced, it leads to the import of cheaper products from foreign countries, and then which further deters the industrial growth. And the second reason why it is unfavorable to developing nations is the categorization of most favored nation by WTO. So under WTO agreement, countries cannot normally discriminate between their trading partners. So for example, they cannot grant someone a special favor such as a lower custom duty or rate, and if you do it for one, you will have to do it for others as well. So what does that mean? That means that if India is providing special treatment to a third country A, it will have to provide the same treatment to company from USA, a company from China. And that is a problem because companies from USA and China are pretty strong, right? Negotiating at WTO or any of its meetings require a very high level of specialized and technical knowledge of not just the law but also about nuances of trade and economy, which developing countries generally do not have. And since they do not have that kind of human resource which can negotiate on their behalf, more often than not, the agreements, especially for African countries, are designed against them. And of course, when it is unfavorable to developing countries, in more aspects, it is favorable to developing nations. Because the way negotiations have been designed or the way agreements work, they enable various kinds of protection. And these protections are applicable only for developed countries. Let's take the agreement on agriculture, which is the framework which governs the farm subsidies of WTO, which is the agreement of WTO which governs the farm subsidies. It has categorized the farm subsidies into trade distorting domestic subsidies and non-trade distorting subsidies. So all those subsidies which are trade distorting shall have to be eliminated, whereas all which are not trade distorting can go on. So all trade distorting subsidies are categorized under amber box, whereas non-trade distorting subsidies are categorized under blue and green boxes. And so under WTO, these are allowed. An interesting fact is that most developed nations provide their farmers with the kinds of subsidies which are categorized under this box, whereas the way India or the way other developing nations provide subsidies to their farmers have been categorized under trade distorting, and it is a pressure on them to put an end or at least reduce these subsidies, which of course is in favor of developed nations. Then recently, there has been a push for change in definition of developing country under the principle of special and differential treatment. So which talks about upgrading certain developing countries from the status of developing. And this is going to deeply impact not just India, but many other countries like China, Egypt, Turkey, as well as South Africa. And the reason behind this is that there is an assumption that these countries have benefited immensely from WTO rules since its formation in 1995. And there is also a belief that these countries have progressed enough that they should not be getting benefits of a developing country. And so that is also going to act in favor of developed nations. Then a very important and a good thing about WTO is that all decisions are made on consensus. There is no concept of voting, and unless and until all the members agree to a particular agreement, that shall not come into force. That is a good thing, but that itself has become the biggest roadblock in the progress of WTO. Since the members of WTO are clearly divided between developed, or you can say global north versus global south, there has been a lack of development on any of the major agreements in last 20 years. And there is a fragmentation among countries. So for example, developed countries want to push their agenda with respect to rules on e-commerce, investment, intellectual property rights. But exactly on these agenda, developing countries are quite reluctant. Similarly, developing countries want to push for reform of agreement on agriculture, which developed countries are not interested because they already are having a lot of benefits from that. Then there are other issues as well. For example, agreement on trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, or acronymed as TRIPS, which is an international legal agreement between all the member nations of WTO with respect to rules regarding protection of intellectual property rights. For example, protection of patents, copyrights, logos, and various other such creations for companies from one country into another. It establishes minimum standards for regulation by national governments of different forms of IP. And it has been mainly criticized by developing countries because of its discriminatory nature. Because it is discriminatory in nature. Why is it discriminatory? Because most of the intellectual properties are owned by countries which belong to developed world. And now they want to sell their products in developing countries but want their IPRs to be protected at the same level as they are protected in developed countries. And now this is leading to creation of artificial scarcity of products, which can be okay in some cases but cannot be good in various fields. For example, in medical fields, in pharmaceuticals. Let's take an example of a medicine. Let's say if India has weak IPR laws, and if a company somehow manages to develop the same medicine which is being sold in America and it starts the manufacturing. That is not possible right now, but at least it is going to save a lot of lives. But with imposition of strict TRIPS laws, only company A, which originally manufactured that medicine, is allowed to sell products in the developing countries as well. Then the next issue arises from dispute resolution mechanism of WTO. Dispute settlement system, or DSS, is a mechanism to resolve trade dispute between and among member states. The members of DSS are also appointed by consensus, and so if one of the member blocks the appointment, it shall become dysfunctional, and it has become dysfunctional since 2019 because of lot of trouble being created by United States, which has led to very low number of judges to produce rulings. There are just not enough judges to produce rulings, and it has led to a huge backlog of cases pending in DSS. And finally, when the countries grow very powerful, they start resorting to unilateral tariffs. If you are reading newspaper, you must have read that in past 2 to 3 years, how China and USA have unilaterally imposed various kinds of tariffs on each other products without paying heed to the rules and procedures of WTO. Similarly, in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, many countries including India have resorted to protectionism despite WTO in existence. So clearly you can understand that challenges in front of WTO are not small. There are mega challenges which the new Director General would have to face. So in this regard, in this discussion, we started by first understanding the context in which the parent body or the predecessor of WTO was formed, that is GATT. That context was extreme protectionism, to counter which a GATT was established, which then passed on the baton to WTO. Then we understood what advantages have been arrived, how it has worked in favor of increasing the global trade, but nonetheless it has its fair share of challenges and issues which needs to be resolved pretty soon. Let us now move on to the next discussion. The next article for discussion appears on page number 13, which is a world page. Iran may have 210 kg of 20% enriched uranium, which is a very serious news. So Iran's atomic agency said yesterday that its stockpile of 20% enriched uranium has reached over 210 kilograms, which is the latest move in defiance against the talks with the West. Now, whenever we read about Iran's nuclear enrichment program or North Korea's nuclear program, we often get to hear this term enrichment a lot. So what does this enrichment actually means? Why is it so important for overall enrichment of a country's nuclear program? And so that is what we are going to understand in this discussion. So starting with some background. So apart from 20% enriched uranium, Iran has also produced 25 kg of 60% enriched uranium, a level that only countries with nuclear weapons have the physical capability to produce. And what makes the 60% enrichment level particularly threatening is that the tricky process of enrichment becomes far easier and requires fewer centrifuges as it moves into higher purities. In other words, getting to 90% purity is much easier starting from 20% and easier still starting from 60%. So basically what Iran wants to communicate to the world is that it is maybe few months away from designing its first nuclear weapon. Or maybe Iran already has one. So all of us know that under the historic 2015 nuclear deal between Iran and P5+1, the world powers, Iran was not meant to enrich uranium above 3.6% level. So to give you the context, nuclear weapons require 90% enriched uranium. And starting from 60%, it looks like Iran is just months away from its nuclear weapon. So what is this enrichment all about? And why is it needed to produce a nuclear weapon? So we know that just like most metals, uranium also comes from nature. But natural uranium consists of two different isotopes. Nearly 99% of the uranium consists of uranium-238, whereas only 0.7% of the uranium is uranium-235. Now, if you want to produce an atomic bomb, if you want to become a nuclear power, uranium-235 is the one which you need to increase because it is the one which is radioactive. It is the one which releases the energy. Whereas uranium-238 is just like your iron. It does not have any radioactivity. And so uranium-235 is a fissile material that can sustain a chain reaction. As you can see on the screen, this chain reaction is what leads to a nuclear bomb or a nuclear reaction inside a nuclear power plant. And so enrichment is a process which increases the proportion of uranium-235 through the process of isotope separation. So you take 1 kg of uranium, remove the 99% of 238, just keep 0.7%. And that is the process. When you repeat it over 1000 times, you ultimately get 20%, 60% or even 90% enriched uranium. So when we talk about enriched uranium, we talk about increasing the number of uranium-235. So the goal of uranium enrichment is to raise the percentage levels of uranium-235, which is often done through the use of centrifuges. As you can see on the screen, these are the machines that spin a form of unrefined or natural uranium at a very high speeds. And the rotation motion leads to the separation of heavier 238 from lighter 235. For nuclear weapons, enrichment is required up to 90% or more, as we have already talked about. But for nuclear reactors, for nuclear power plants, enrichment is required up to 3-4% level. And so that is why when Iran nuclear deal was finalized, when Iran claimed that it needs an access to its own nuclear power plant, it was allowed enrichment up to 3-4%. But now what it looks like that it already has 20% enriched capability and has acquired 60% enriched uranium from somewhere. And since we are talking about Iran nuclear deal, we cannot go without discussing the key points. In 2015, Iran with P5+1 group of world powers, which were USA, UK, France, China, Russia and Germany, agreed on a long-term deal on its nuclear program. The deal was named as Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Under the deal, Iran agreed to curb its nuclear activity in return for the lifting of sanctions and access to the global trade. The agreement allowed Iran to accumulate small amounts of uranium for research and for producing power, but it banned the enrichment of uranium, which could be used to make nuclear weapons. Iran was also required to redesign a heavy water reactor being built, whose spent fuel would contain plutonium suitable for a bomb and to allow international inspections. In May 2018, however, the USA abandoned the deal, criticizing its flawed nature and reinstated the sanctions on Iran, which impacted India also, because Iran became the second largest supplier of crude oil to India, and India had to cut down that almost to the zero level. Now, since the sanctions were tightened, Iran has gone back on the treaty and has been steadily breaking some of its commitment to pressure the remaining signatories to find a way to provide sanction relief. So from the perspective of prelims examination, this is a very important news. The term JCPOA has already been asked in the prelims examination, and it is important for you to understand the enrichment process, or what does it actually mean. Let us now move on to the next news. This article appears as a lead column on page number 6, Need for Climate Law. So in light of PM's commitment at Glasgow for Panchamrit solution aiming at reducing fossil fuel dependence and carbon intensity and ramping up its renewable energy share by 50% by 2030, India needs to legislate a climate law to achieve its goal of climate justice. And this is the main contention of the author. According to the author, as of now, India has a lot of laws dealing with environment. For example, Environment Protection Act, Wildlife Protection Act, Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act, Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act. All of these are there. But still, there is no law which deals with the climate change or increasing vulnerability of our country against the climate change. The most powerful law, if we talk about in terms of environment, is the Environment Protection Act 1986. Which is grossly inadequate to deal with the violations on climate. And just to give you a very simple example, Section 24 of Environment Protection Act deals with the penalties. If there is a situation where any act or omission constitutes an offence punishable under this act and also under any other act, then the offender found guilty of such offence shall be liable to be punished under the other act and not under the EPA 1986. Thus, this clearly reflects that EPA is subordinate to other laws, for example, the Indian Penal Code. So this is just a single demonstration about the issues, inherent problems of EPA 1986. But there is another problem as well, and which is non-integration or lack of integration of climate change and global warming, adaptation and mitigation into India's legal framework. As comprehensive climate action is not just technological, such as changing energy sources or carbon intensity, but also nature-based. For example, emphasizing restoration of ecosystems, reducing natural hazard, and increasing carbon sinks. And so specifically because of these two reasons, author advocates for a new law on climate change. And according to the author, it should have two provisions compulsorily. The first, creating an institution that monitors action plans for climate change, and a system of liability and accountability. So as far as creating an institution which would monitor action plans for climate change is concerned, it could be named as Commission on Climate Change, which can be set up with power and authority to issue directions and oversee implementation of the plans and programs on climate change. So the commission could also have quasi-judicial powers just like NGT or National Green Tribunal, with powers of a civil court to ensure that its directions are followed in letter and spirit. It should be assisted by a technical committee which can advise the commission in the discharge of its functions as well as guide various private and public agencies in meeting their climate-related obligations. As an example, the commission could look at agencies or institutions that have a disproportionate impact on climate or environment and suggest lower energy pathways that are adhered to. As far as system of liability and accountability is concerned, it should be short-term, medium-term and long-term levels. This also means having a legally enforceable national climate change plan that goes beyond just the policy guidelines. So you can clearly see that the idea proposed by the author is quite great. Just like when pollution emerged as one of the major problems, we legislated laws to counter pollution, to control pollution. And as it is clear that climate change is here to stay and it is a big problem, it is time for us to legislate a law to contain the climate change and convert almost all the actions so far which are executive in nature into a legislative framework. US jabs still out of reach in India due to indemnity issue. More than 6 months after the central government announced it would fast-track clearances for foreign COVID-19 vaccines in India, facilitate quicker access and encourage imports, indemnity issues are still holding up the import of all American vaccines to our country, including Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson and Moderna. With Australia, India, Japan, US Quad pressing ahead with plans to produce Johnson & Johnson vaccine at a facility in Hyderabad, officials indicated that the indemnity clause required by US companies to avoid legal liability for their vaccines could mean that India will produce the vaccines only for export and not to supply them domestically. So what is this indemnity clause and why is it sought? So in very simple terms, indemnity means security against a loss or other financial stress. In legal terms, it means a contractual obligation of one party to compensate another party due to the acts of the former. The law on drugs in India does not have a provision for indemnity related to grant of approval for any new drug or vaccine in the country. And if at all any indemnity is to be granted to any company for a particular drug or vaccine, it can only be in form of an indemnity bond executed on behalf of the Government of India or a clause or a set of clauses in any contract that the government may sign with the supplier. There is no precedent for any company getting such indemnity in India for any kind of drug. And hence, in the absence of such indemnity, overseas manufacturers may load the risk onto the price of the vaccines, making each dose more expensive. As far as overall legal framework of our country is concerned, Indian Contract Act Section 124 does provides for indemnity. It defines a contract of indemnity as one by which one party promises to save the other party from any loss caused to the latter. Once the Government of India grants such indemnity to the vaccine manufacturer or importer, it would mean that if a particular vaccine is perceived to have caused death or any lasting damage to a recipient, any claim of compensation arising from it will have to be met by the government and not by the company. In the event of a court ordering payment, the company will be in a position to recover the amount from the government. So this discussion was just to let you know what indemnity is all about and why is it holding back the inclusion of American vaccines into Indian vaccination program against the COVID. Let us now move on to the next news. Duty cuts, stock limits helped curtail edible oil prices, says the government. So the prices of most major cooking oils dropped about 5 to 10 rupees per litre in Delhi and as much as around 20 rupees in some major cities in the run-up to Diwali. However, the national average retail prices of cooking oils showed little change, and mustard oil, which is only produced domestically, continued to see rising prices. Now, when considered in isolation, this might not look like a very important news. But if you look into the UPSC syllabus of mains paper, especially GS paper 3, you know that major crops, their cropping pattern, marketing of agriculture produce and issues related and constraints is a part of your syllabus. And so you can clearly see that rise in the prices of oils, especially the edible oil, is a part of your syllabus. And so it is important for us to understand the reason behind increase and such sharp and continuous increase in the prices of the oil. Starting with that there is an exceptional high inflation as far as prices of oil is concerned in the international markets. And so all those oils in which even a minority of the portion is imported, you will see the impact there. Then the next is the duties which we impose on import of these oil. It is extremely high. So for example, import duties on edible oil is as high as 35% against the global practice of 10 to 15%. Then there is a sudden surge in demand of oil seeds due to revival of economy, especially the food markets. During the lockdown, almost all the eateries were closed, and so there were very less demand. And frankly, no one was expecting the COVID to go away, at least temporarily, so soon. And so the supply could not be ramped up before the demand kicked in. Then if we talk about a very general reason which is acting behind the scenes very gradually, is the gradual increase in per capita income in our country. As the per capita income increases, the expenditure on oil also increases, which leads to changing food habits of people. Then as more and more people with higher income become a part of economy, it leads to diversification of demand of oil seeds. So for example, initially a person belonging to a low income group could only consume local oil. But as soon as the income increases, they start cooking their food in olive oil. And so the demand of palm oil and olive oil increasing, which is also reflected in higher prices. Then last month was the festive season in our country, which has led to very high demand peak last month. Then during the lockdown, since most of the people were at their homes, which is the place where mustard oil is preferably used, which was the main reason behind shoot up in the prices of mustard oil. Then cropping pattern in India is not meeting the rising demand of edible oils due to monotonic nature, high focus on cereals, pulses and horticulture. Even the focus on pulses and horticulture is quite new. And now we are talking about third level of diversification, which will include the harvesting of oil seeds. Then finally, a general factor which is applicable to all food grains in our country is small farm sizes and outdated farming practices, which results in higher inefficiency in agriculture, which then converts into low overall productivity. For example, the yield of soybean in Brazil is around 3 times that of India. And so you can clearly understand that there are 10 major reasons because of which we have seen shoot up in the edible oil prices in our country. Let us now move on to the next news. The next article for discussion again appears on page number 1. In Kedarnath, PM hails India's rishi tradition. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi has inaugurated several developmental works in Kedarnath, Uttarakhand. So just for the location, you know where Kedarnath is located. And the plans also included the unveiling of a statue of Adi Shankara and the monuments related to his samadhi. Now, from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services Prelims examination, it is important for us to know about Adi Shankara and his philosophy, because questions based on philosophy have been asked in the prelims in the past, as you can see in one of the questions in the previous year questions. So starting with the Adi Shankara himself. He is also known as, or famously known as, Shankaracharya, who was born in Kalari, Kerala in 788 CE. He propounded the doctrine of Advait or monoism and wrote many commentaries on the Vedic canon like Upanishads, Brahma Sutras and Bhagavad Gita in Sanskrit. His major work included Brahma Sutra Bhashya or commentary on Brahma Sutra, Bhaj Govinda Stotra and Nirvana Shatkam. He was responsible for the revival of Hindu philosophy at a time when Buddhism was gaining great momentum in our country. He is credited to establish 4 mutts in 4 different locations. He is the one responsible for establishment of 4 mutts across 4 directions in our country: Shringeri, Puri, Dwarka and Badrinath. The purpose behind these establishments were propagation of Sanatan Dharma in 4 corners of our country. Of course, he was opposed to Buddhist philosophers, and the philosophy of Adi Shankara is a part of Vedanta, which is also one of the 6 schools of Astic Hindu philosophy. Now, from the perspective of prelims examination, of course, the personality, the Adi Shankara, is important. But what is more important is to understand Advait philosophy, or the principle of non-dualism. That is, there are no two, there is just one, which is mainly derived from Upanishads and which has been elaborated in detail by eminent scholars like Gaudapad and Sri Adi Shankaracharya himself. So Dvait means two, or duality, or dualism between God and the universe, and both are conceptualized as separate realities. But Advait, or non-dualism, means absence of dualism between the creator or the God and the created or the subjects. So Advait school believes that Brahman is the one and only reality, and everything else is mere appearance, projection, formation or illusion. And one of the most common examples used to describe the state is momentarily seeking a snake in a rope when it is lying in the darkness. The snake is an illusion and the rope is the reality. And in the same manner, according to the Advait philosophy, the world appears in the mind as a formation over the self.